was interesting. I do believe it is important to learn the lessons of history, but what I kind of interpreted the history lesson from my friends on the other side of the aisle, it reminds me of my 6-year-old son and my 7-year-old daughter when I tell one of them to make their beds and they said, well, my brother didn't do it, so why should I do it? So yes, I frankly wish that the GSEs had been taken care of on our watch. I believe there was certainly a majority of Republicans who wanted to do that. I think about 95% of the Democrats were opposed to it. And people say, for example, well, the Federal Reserve never did anything with respect to consumer protection. But I know in all the years I've been on this committee, every time Alan Greenspan showed up, he pleaded for us to do something with respect to Fannie and Freddie. And I didn't see any help on the other side of the aisle. Now, I know the chairman has spoken of the bill that he managed to get passed, but I would point out as a history lesson, since that was passed, according to the regulator of the GSEs, we're now looking at about $1 trillion of taxpayer exposure for the GSEs. They've driven out all the private players in the market. So if that is reform, I would hate to see what the absence of reform looks like.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will.
That one, I think, I was telling the gentleman, is unfair. We didn't pass it. It didn't become law until 2008. This House passed it in 2007. Had it been acted on at that point, it might have averted some of the danger. The other thing I would say is it was very much what the Bush administration wanted. So it did come too late to avert the danger. But any suggestion that it caused the problem, I think, is the problem was it came too late. We tried to get it done a year earlier.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the chairman's sentiment. On to the Republican substitute. I think really it's important that people really focus on the difference between two approaches here. And number one, I do think it's telling that we continue to talk about the GSEs, and I'm very disappointed that I haven't seen any GSE reform legislation coming out of the administration, when clearly it was the major but-for cause. But what we have now, I believe, is a bill that is sweeping, that is draconian in its takeover of a huge portion of our economy. Just through the time that we have discussed it, it's clear that many ambiguities remain in this legislation. But after the government takeover of large segments of the banking sector, after the government takeover of large segments of our automotive industry, after the government takeover of Fannie and Freddie, by some estimates, the consumer credit businesses that could be touched, the financial services product businesses that could be touched by this legislation, could be 10% of our economy. I mean, how much more do you want the people who are running AIG and GM and major banks, how much do you trust them to decide whether or not you get a mortgage, whether or not you get a credit card? So number one, it represents on this side of the aisle a huge takeover of a segment of our economy. Second of all, job loss. I think I heard the gentleman from North Carolina say that a number of companies certainly have margins, I don't want to put words in his mouth, sufficient margins to take these costs. Well, I'm not sure what the economy looks like in his portion of North Carolina, but unfortunately in the 5th District of Texas, people are losing their jobs every single day. Every single day, some small business is going under. And to the small business people I talk to in the 5th Congressional District of Texas, they can't get credit. Here we are in the midst of a huge, huge national credit crunch. And so the bill wants to create a huge new federal agency to make credit less available and more expensive at a time where we have the highest unemployment rate in a quarter of a century. That simply makes no sense to me. And how you can call a piece of legislation that ultimately turns the right over to a federal bureaucrat to decide what credit cards you get based on the term unfair or abusive, whether or not you can get a home mortgage loan, and somehow say that is furthering consumer rights. The consumers I know want to choose these products for themselves. The substitute says, let's have effective disclosure. A lot of this disclosure is mandated by the federal government. It's huge, it's voluminous, it's written in legalese. And we can simplify that. It's probably the one area where there is some agreement. And so I would urge adoption of the Republican substitute. Now, yield back the balance of my time.